Well, we started off the discussion thinking that it was going to be just how the submittal travels through the different parties. And it really transitioned into a how do we break down these walls and avoid the checkpoints because they do create inefficiency.
These are true stories
of the shared pains
facing designers,
builders,
inspectors,
and operators
on a quest to streamline collaboration
in the digital age. Find out what happens
when industry and technology
stop playing nice
and start getting real.
We are the Construction Progress Coalition.
And this is the Shared Pains Podcast. Welcome to the Construction Shared Pains Podcast. My name is Sasha Reed, and as your host, my role is to help all of us gain a new perspective on the systemic changes that are needed for design and construction to thrive in the digital age. In episode 4, we turn the conversation from validation to innovation. The first CDX Innovation Challenge we'll tackle from this year's Open Integration Summit is a Submittal exchange presented by Autodesk. Here to break down the shared pains with transforming the Submittal exchange is CPC's Thought Leadership Chair and Construction Technologist, Dan Smimillo.
From the general contractor's perspective, submittals can oftentimes feel like a very overbearing or sometimes redundant but necessary process. On more traditional design-build contracts, there is significant waste in the overlap of how much a designer should design and how much a detailer should detail. On more progressive design, build, or integrated project delivery projects, there's generally less of a waste and overlapping work, but there remains the risk of miscommunication wherever the handoff occurs between liable designer and responsible contractor. How do we reduce the waste that is generated from the redundant work between engineers and trade detailers? How will prefabrication and modular design disrupt the traditional submittal process? Is there such a thing as a fully 3D design review? To address these daunting questions, we should look at a common data exchange as the framework or language that all parties can speak together to produce the most efficient submittal workflow, given the specific project risks and constraints.
The process is fairly simple. Digest, debate, decide, and deliver. Bringing together industry and technology perspectives, we'll first digest the root causes of our submittal process inefficiencies, then debate the different strategies to overcome these real-world barriers from each side so that you, the listener, can strategically decide where and when to invest your resources to streamline process through integrated technology. Here to guide us through the different perspectives presented in this episode is CPC's Executive Director and our roving reporter, Nathan Wood.
Thanks, Sasha. Let's kick off this discussion with a conversation I had back at Bluebeam XCon with
Brianna HalfID, and I come from the general contractor's perspective, and I'm now working for Clark Pacific as a project manager, starting up one of their subset products under their precast group, doing the modular buildings and panelized walls. So slightly different than your traditional subcontractor, more manufacturing focused.
As a manufacturing-focused trade contractor, I wanted to ask Brianna to explain a little bit about why submittals exist in the first place.
So the submittal, from my perspective, would be the checkpoint between the architect and the owner to ensure that the general contractor is going to be providing the product that they've specified and it meets all of the requirements that they've outlined in their documents.
Next, you'll hear from
Ian Brown. I'm a project manager with Baronne Steel Fabricators out of Brooklyn, New York. Introduced into the kind of the PDF guidelines. Like, wow, this is a great tool. Obviously, there's a lot of inefficiencies in the construction industry, and to get involved. I want to be a part of the solution, not the problem.
Recognizing the inherent challenges with steel construction in New York City, I want to ask Ian a little bit about what his biggest shared pains are.
You know, a lot of times you get partial thoughts on drawings, right? Or maybe details that are called out that aren't actually shown on the drawings yet. Or, I mean, you might waste an entire submittal doing the connections the way you want to do them, what's most efficient for you. And they might come back and say, no, I don't want a shear tab. I only want double angles. Use double angles here. No, you can't have slotted shear tabs here. Even if all the connection engineering and everything works on it.
This dilemma between what's most efficient for the design engineer versus the detailer or fabricator is nothing new. While down in Orlando for the Lean Construction Institute, I was hanging out at the Autodesk booth with
Ian Coates. I'm a technical specialist, specifically around structural BIM right now. My background really came from steel fabrication. Got into what was originally AutoCAD, of course, as everyone did, and then started using a program called StrueCAD. And it was really, you built a wireframe and then you hit a button and it produced steel fabrication shop drawings and CNC data.
All right, Nathan. So this episode has no shortage of its own TLAs, or 3-letter acronyms, as we learned last episode.
yet again.
So let's do our due diligence. CNC.
Yes, CNC, I actually had to look up the formal definition because hardly anyone ever says computer numerical control. But basically when you talk about CNC fabrication or CNC cutters, it's what steel and mechanical fabricators will use inside their shops to leverage information from BIM to more automate their cutting and fabrication process.
Great. And BIM.
Oh, I already said one, didn't I? In answering a TLA, I said another TLA. So yeah, BIM is building information model or modeling, which is a great segue back to Ian's perspective, which spans from CAD, computer-aided design, to the evolution of BIM.
It was about 5 years ago now, Autodesk acquired a software called Advanced Steel. It gave me an opportunity to do things I wanted to do and perhaps maybe change the industry, motivate the industry to move forward. And that's how I'm really delighted to be involved in the Construction Progress Coalition as well, because it's something that I think we can really help drive industry practices forward and simplify a lot of the work that's out there.
Of course, we couldn't agree more, but I wanted to challenge Ian on how BIM is fundamentally changing the process of coordination and shop drawing submittals.
So there has to be that coordination model, and we're getting better at being proactive about that. I mean, in my time in the industry, it was a case of we made sure that our steel didn't clash with our steel, and then we sent it to the GC, and whatever he did with it there, I have no idea, but I'm assuming that he obviously put it into a combined model with the HVAC and the mechanical and any other models that he had, and made sure that they didn't clash or didn't interfere. Again, a reactive process. Yeah. Whereas now with cloud computing, we're able to share that model many, many times and many times through our development process as a steel fabricator, so that if we do accidentally put a staircase through an elevator shaft, then we know about it there and then.
And if you think that's crazy talk, just wait to hear my discussion in Atlanta last week at the Georgia Tech Digital Building Lab Symposium, where I sat down with
Paul Doherty. I'm a licensed architect, a real one, not a software architect. So as a young architect intern, we learned a lot about how technology could be integrated into the built environment. I had implemented a thing called Lotus Notes to manage our projects as a design build firm. And within 2 weeks after discovering Mosaic and this little thing called a hyperlink, I said, forget the traditional software systems, this thing's gold. Just to fast forward, I wrote some books about how to use it for architects, engineers, and contractors back in the mid-90s. But what it did was it gave me an introduction into how disruption can actually be a positive thing. Today, I am the founder and chairman of an organization called TDG, short for the Digit Group. We're an international organization. I've now graduated to the level of a real estate developer, both at risk and for fee. But we're doing things a lot differently than traditional real estate developers.
Paul's unique approach to development and infrastructure planning has been dubbed smart cities, which of course I had to ask him about.
I'm just not a big fan of the term, but if you're branded, run with it, because it's now reached the tipping point to be on the lips and in the minds of decision makers at the highest government levels in the world.
So I was curious for someone as forward-thinking and on the bleeding edge of innovation as Paul about what challenges he faces in his role.
I have to anticipate needs that have not been defined yet. Which means that when we talk about a smart city, a high-performance urban environment, we're constantly looking at individual pieces of innovation that are so cool unto themselves, but when they collide with another one, that collision is either going to be violent or it's going to be like dovetailing. And our job as real estate developers is to come in with the measures of safety, security, and quality of life and put together the proper recipe of those innovations.
This is something that we talked on last stage with Fred Mills at London Build. Was his question he was asking is, how do we make digital construction mainstream? And I said half the time, those of us who are at the bleeding edge of industry and will sit in a room and debate the nuances of naming conventions.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of we need new standards, but are we really getting rid of the old broken standards?
Steel guys love referencing the code of standard practice, and it basically says whatever. It doesn't matter if the drawings are stamped 70%. It doesn't matter if the drawings are stamped 20% drawings. When you're cut loose to start detailing, that's the snapshot in time. That's what you're detailing off of.
And because of this motivational dilemma, we end up in situations where,
well, there's just so many checkpoints and so many baton handoffs between multiple people that the data gets stopped multiple times along the way, and it's not efficient.
But we have to remember that the goal is not to eliminate submittals, but to improve why we've always done them in the first place.
The whole idea about submitting was for checks and balances. Humans are humans. The only thing you can count on with a human is their irrationality. And if you take that context, we have to have certain steps in a process just to double check to make sure that the welfare, the health, and the safety of the general public is kept in mind.
So if submittals aren't going away anytime soon, how do we improve them?
And you really need to break down those walls and make sure that all of the right people are in the room talking about what the submittal is and what's wrong with what they've submitted versus the stop and go.
So Nathan, as you're talking about this idea of timing, this brings me back to one of our interactions years ago where as technology essentially interrupted the process. And you were able to capture that time back by leveraging technology to change the way that you do this normal, serial process of submitting, getting designer feedback, then getting the information you need, then implementing in the field. I mean, timing really is at the crux of the conversation.
Exactly, which is where I think we have a really interesting opportunity to learn something from our international friends.
What happens in Europe quite frequently is that you want to ask as many RFIs as possible, whereas what happens here in the US tends to be that we ask the questions at the submittal stage. And so what that means is that we then have a ton of work to do when the submittals come back.
If you are working on a government funded project in Singapore, you as the architect now have a design tool that allows you to publish up your model, and the CoreNet system will at least give it the first glance, almost like the way that you go to a building inspector the first time, and it just takes a look at the basics. Do you have enough sprinklers in that? Do you need sprinklers, or do you have enough sprinkler coverage because you're 25 feet out from an exit? Just the simple things.
Rules, the rules basic.
Right.
Yeah, it's less of the cognitive thinking, just the very simple rules.
All the rules, right? And if you've at least passed that, then he can sit down and he can actually inspect before he grants a permit, right? Yep. That alone saves tens of millions of dollars a year because you can now self-check yourself with the CoreNet to say, you know what, this is as good as we're going to get it. Now let's go already into phase 2 of getting your building permit. We perfected our system that we are creating 250 square meter homes to 2,500 square feet, fully finished, structural insulated panels, and with 0 defects, 0 waste in under 7 minutes in Shanghai.
Paul's got me thinking that maybe the only reason that we haven't built 7-minute homes or 7-minute apartments in the US is just because we haven't put our minds to it. We haven't thought that way before.
It's not so much the speed as it is we redefine the process of what it means to manufacture a city. When technology becomes transparent to the process, where are the real gains that can be measured? And we figured out, both with our greenfield cities and our implementing innovations into existing cities, that it comes down to 3 main levels that are worldwide issues. One is safety, security, and a measurable higher quality of life.
So if you take those three categories, the submittal is really the most critical tool on the job site.
Because the submission processes are there for a purpose. Sometimes you want the project to breathe. 7-minute homes are cool, but guess what? We had to rethink, how do we get the eyeballs of people to authenticate that what we did in the digital world came out in the physical world the way that it was supposed to. And the more that we can focus in on that and do proper submissions, I think then we can reinvent and actually take a good stab at taking out the wasteful submissions.
All right. Have I lost you yet, Sasha?
I was a subcontractor. I did installation drawings, and I had to mark core drill locations on drawings that architects never located and stuff like that. But that was like such a small piece of it. I've never been exposed to all these different processes. So I'm as much a student in this process as I'm, kind of a guide.
Well, what a great example. I mean, exactly. We're all exposed to so many new processes that we had never been exposed to before. That's part of this digital economy, is that the communication and transparency of things that we were never transparent with before is what makes this so new and scary for everyone.
On a typical structural steel building, obviously we would sequence from 1 to whatever and break down our sequencing by floor, by however we're going to fabricate it in the most efficient way possible. So a lot of times on these miscellaneous jobs or innovation jobs, we may run into obviously it's still most efficient for us to go page by page and submit floor by floor. But that might not necessarily be the way the architect or engineer wants to review it or approve it.
Sheer pain that happens a lot in the construction industry where joist and deck manufacturing takes place. We never know as steel retailers where to place those joists until the mechanical guy tells us where he's going to put his air handling units, for example. So, and this is a chicken and egg scenario because the air handling unit can't be placed until he knows how many joists are going to be there to take the load. So we go round and round, and at the end of the day, we kind of guess it in a lot of cases.
These motivational dilemmas between whether it's the engineer and the trade contractor, or from trade contractor to trade contractor, they're not going away anytime soon. But thankfully, now that we're having these more open and transparent discussions, I think we can see that folks are having some conclusions and coming to some real opportunities for innovation moving forward.
Well, we started off the discussion thinking that it was going to be just how the submittal travels through the different parties and what those checkpoints look like and what software platforms are used. And it really transitioned into how do we break down these walls and avoid the checkpoints because they do create inefficiency. And instead of breaking down the step-by-step, we said those steps need to go away, and it needs to be a common platform that everyone operates in where that we can all work together at the same time.
We basically came up with a minimum level of development where we would essentially have the minimum requirements to release your, say, structural steel drawings in this instance. That would be dimensions. It would be any specific criteria, any kind of restrictions as far as connection engineering, type of bolts. It should all be addressed in that document.
Okay, so if step 1 is having and documenting those conversations, then step 2 must be focused around all the measurement and those key performance indicators.
If there was a way of grading those elements in a model and bringing that together into being a classification of the entire model, so that an engineer, a design team, whoever it happens to be that's handing off this submittal or passing off these contract documents, can say that there is a completeness.
So I like this idea that Ian brought up of like a GPA score for your BIM's completeness. But if we're going to create new standards, then of course we have to get rid of some older standards, right? Why do we still have to have revise and resubmit? Why cannot we have this idea of, again, a CDX session or a Bluebeam session or any of these cloud sessions that have a period of time, that have a beginning and an end, and they have rules as to who can submit what and who needs to have seen it, and then who actually needs to formally stamp and submit it. And if anything isn't right by any of those parties, they raise a flag and we leave that session open until it's closed.
And then at that point, if you've already begun detailing and it changes, then it's a change order, and all it's doing is driving more cost and longer duration to produce a deliverable, right?
And part of the conversation we're happening is that actually the mindset of steel is not that we need to make decisions earlier, but actually allow through technology for steel to be more flexible, so that what is truly that last responsible moment at the boundary of alignment before you start detailing, and it has one cost versus crossing that boundary of realization, it's got another cost that's even more. You could really well track that in what you do, but not until we have that mindset that encourages that type of tracking.
The different processes that you look at, specifically with CDX, and why that's such an important piece, is that we can start to automate things by also keeping the human relationship in play.
Because as we keep saying, this is about communication. So we don't have that common language on which to define what maybe the completeness of a design is.
Completeness of a design model is such a subjective term as well. Like, there is nobody who can say, right, this is completely complete and correct, because every project is a refinement of an idea until they hand over the keys, right?
So the answer is increased collaboration. But at what cost?
Difficult, because it's easy to answer that question by saying, well, what we should do is we should bring the detailer, fabricator into the design team. But if you do that for every single trade that's going to be on site, how big does your design table have to be to accommodate all of these people, right? So that's perhaps not the answer.
However, the promise of technology is that we can do that work more efficiently and more collaboratively if we all come together speaking the same language.
Having the GCs empower the trade partners to have those conversations is going to be equally important. So I think it's knowing who the smart owners are, knowing who the GCs that view subcontractors as trade partners is going to be really important moving forward to change the way the industry currently works.
And part of that common language is actually being able to speak digitally.
How to make environments that are data-driven but human-centric. And that balance is going to be about the cyber-physical relationship, this whole idea of the fourth generation of the Industrial Revolution. And this is where the exciting part is for everyone that's listening to this podcast. We've never had this opportunity before, where the canvases have been now turned from a glob of a lot of color and confusion into a whiteness of a canvas.
BIM certainly acts as that transformational canvas, but only when we really look at it for the data and identifying those leading indicators as opposed to lagging indicators.
We put out a model, and then we get a whole bunch of design RFIs back. Then that's reacting, right? What would be more proactive would perhaps having some kind of way of analysing and applying an attribute data to the element.
Unless you're building 7-minute apartments in Singapore, there's probably some level of traditional standards that needs to integrate into new standards.
People wanted the checkpoints that they're used to, but you need to have something that is certified that can be referenced back to in an official manner, but also captures all of the comments along the way. All of the information is going to be set to you, and it's trackable and you can monitor it, but that also gives people the opportunity to work together. You do need the general contractor, the sub, and the architect all in the same platform to get everyone in the room to capture all of the content along the way.
As we build closer and more transparent relationships between the trade contractors and the engineers, it's really imperative that we start to let down our guard and not use a lot of the same traditional tactics that we've seen in the past that are creating the waste and inefficiency within the submittal workflows.
If all it is capturing what's already marked up on the drawings, it should not, they've already covered themselves. They've already made the markup. So now it's just a matter of making sure that we do our job and it's actually realized.
But at the same time, we do need to have that time-stamped information that says, yes, this is accurate. And even the GC wants it. They want to know that the architect looked at it and that their subcontractor is installing the right product. So everyone wants these checks and balances, but we don't want them to be as inefficient as they are.
But this paradox with technology adoption and efficiency is that you actually have to go slower before you can go faster. Ian Coates describes a little bit of the history of what Autodesk has been doing to help at least steel contractors with the transition from CAD to BIM detailing.
It's been happening slowly in the background over the past couple of years. As you know, we acquired Advanced Steel, and what we've been doing is we took a whole bunch of the functionality that exists in Advanced Steel. Advanced Steel is not going away, it's still going to be that AutoCAD vertical and available. But what we've done is we've taken all of that functionality, or a big portion of it so far, and we plugged that into Revit. So now in Revit, you've got the capability to use and apply a whole bunch of standard connections really easily. No buildings are ever made up of completely framed 90-degree steel, simple steel connection structures. And now Revit has the capability for steel to be able to do those connections as well. So you're talking about individual plates, cuts, bolts and welds, all of that information that can be added to your Revit model. So again, you can do really custom connections to transfer that information over to Advanced Steel, which has the automatic drawing production if you need it, and of course the CNC data.
It's become pretty clear that technology is not the barrier to transforming the submittal exchange, which really leaves us with the people and the process.
The urbanization is happening. It will, and it is continuing to happen. It will accelerate. The UN by 2050, which is not that far away, is now saying that 83% of the world's population will be in some sort of urban environment, which means that we know that the urban environments have been created since day one. We're about trading ports and that type of thing, where people congregated together to trade and commerce and get economies of scale between food, safety, security, that type of thing, which morphed into, these cities that now are places where, culture and other types of soft sides of society can thrive.
Given these market pressures, how will general contractors and trade contractors collaborate more closely, even if they don't sign collaborative contracts?
It really does come to how comfortable they are, because I've had drawings come back, revise and resubmit, and I've had, the GC go to bat for us and pick up the phone and say, hey, look, does this really need to be revised and resubmit?
Not only do we need to collaborate between different project stakeholder perspectives, but also between different generational perspectives.
There's got to be a two-way mentorship, because these kids know what they're doing, and they're finding ways of not just cutting corners, but of doing things differently, and they need to communicate that back up to the more experienced group. When firms start to have that fundamental understanding that this is a necessity for us to progress and move forward, we're going to be in a world that says submissions are going to be not just reports and that type of thing. They're going to start turning into analytics. We're talking dashboarding. We're talking everything in real time before things get to the point of that realization where you have to now pull down the drywall because the drywall contractor got aggressive and locked up that wall before the inspector came.
That was one of the things that really struck out for me was this is technology interrupting a system that is not designed for collaboration. I feel like what we're doing is creating shadow boxes. That now I'm dating myself. I don't know if you remember shadow boxes.
No.
So back in the day, you used to use a shoe box and you take the top off it and tip it on its side so it was open, and you cut out and create little vignettes of a scene. You create a little scene in a shadow box. And I feel like what we're doing is we're literally cutting out sections of the industry and parts of this process and focusing and describing the scenario. What are we seeing in here? And doing it at such a detail that I don't think most people, unless they do that work, get any kind of visibility to.
I think that's a great way of describing how we're not boiling the ocean, but yet we're giving people the tools to boil the ocean by therefore forcing them to not boil the ocean, by creating these vignettes that are focused on the workflow with the same impacted stakeholders or the same subset of impacted stakeholders, the same, data standards that we're referencing from, but it's always contextualized to that workflow vignette.
So it's hard to articulate to outsiders why we say things are complex when we talk about designing and building, but it's these vignettes of these very specific interactions that happen on a project that I think the podcast is really being able to provide people. And for some, maybe the first time they're actually able to look at Brady Bunch style, a bunch of vignettes happening at the same time, and truly understand why it's so complex, why it's so relationship based, and why its interconnectedness is what makes or breaks every project, because the interdependencies between each team, although incentives are not aligned, they're absolutely interconnected and interdependent in order for each to do their job.
Of course, always an initial hesitation with doing something this new and this disruptive.
And it's almost a chicken and an egg. Do we wait for permission to start doing it, or do we just start doing it in order to get permission?
And what we're finding is most of these success stories, they're doing it at risk, that they're going above and beyond to prove it first before waiting for the public policy, which is a very American way for us to do it compared to, say maybe the UK.
Next episode, we'll tackle our last CDX challenge, transforming the as-built handover, where we'll talk about building asset data from design through operations and maintenance. For more information on CPC membership, or to participate in a CDX Task Force initiative, visit constructionprogress.org. Thank you for listening to episode 4 of the Construction Shared Pains podcast. We look forward to joining you here next time.